His name was Robert. He survived D-Day. He survived the Battle of the Bulge. He survived the liberation of a concentration camp in April 1945. He was home by Christmas. His daughter was born in 1946, and in the spring of 1947, he walked into his garage and didn't come back out. The official cause of death was listed as suicide. The real cause had no name yet. Robert was not unusual. He was one of 16 million Americans who served in World War II, and when the war ended, the world threw them a parade, handed them a train ticket, and told them to go home and be normal. Most people assumed they would. Most people assumed that surviving was the hard part, that once the shooting stopped, the damage stopped with it. They were wrong. And what actually happened to those men, what the war did to them that no weapon ever could, is one of the most important and most ignored stories in the entire history of human psychology. Let's start with what they came home from, because most people's understanding of WWII combat is built from films, clean heroism, decisive moments, men who knew what they were fighting for and felt good about it afterward. The reality was different in ways that are almost impossible to describe. In the Pacific, soldiers reported spending weeks in jungle positions watching their friends decompose beside them because moving the bodies meant exposure to sniper fire. In Europe, bomber crews flew missions where the statistical probability of surviving a full tour was, at certain points in 1943, below 30%. They flew anyway. Every single morning, they woke up and climbed back into the aircraft, knowing the numbers.
At Normandy, the men in the first wave had a life expectancy measured in seconds after the ramp dropped. And these were not men who had been trained to process what they were seeing. They were 19 and 20 years old. They were factory workers and farmers and grocery store clerks from Ohio and Georgia and Minnesota. They had been handed a rifle, given 8 weeks of basic training, and shipped across an ocean to watch things happen to human bodies that the human mind was never designed to absorb. But here is where it gets complicated, because most of them didn't break during the war. Most of them held together. They functioned, they followed orders, they kept moving, and the psychological community watching from a distance assumed this meant they were coping. It did not mean that at all. What it meant was something far more disturbing, and a psychiatrist named John Appel, working for the U.S. Army during the war, was one of the first people to begin to understand it. Appel interviewed hundreds of combat soldiers. He was trying to figure out who broke and who didn't. What he found destroyed the assumption that psychological collapse was a sign of weakness. His conclusion was stark. Every man had a breaking point. Not some men. Every man. The only variable was how long it took to reach it. Appel calculated that after 200 to 240 days of continuous combat, virtually every soldier would develop what they then called combat exhaustion. Not a few, not the fragile ones, all of them. The human nervous system, he argued, was simply not built to sustain that level of threat activation indefinitely. It was like running an engine at maximum output with no cooldown. Eventually, the engine didn't break down dramatically, it just stopped being able to return to idle. That was the first thing nobody understood. The second thing nobody understood was what happened when the threat disappeared. Because when these men came home, the threat disappeared. The war was over, the enemy was defeated, and everyone around them, their parents, their wives, their neighbors, assumed that meant the nervous system would simply reset, that the men would exhale, sleep it off, and come back to themselves. Instead, something strange happened. The body kept running the war. In the late 1970s, researchers studying Vietnam veterans began documenting a cluster of symptoms that didn't fit any existing psychiatric category. Flashbacks so vivid the men genuinely could not distinguish them from reality. Hypervigilance so extreme that sitting with their back to a restaurant door felt physically impossible. Emotional numbness so complete that they couldn't feel anything for the people they loved most. Sleep architecture so destroyed that they hadn't had an interrupted night in years. But as the research deepened, the psychiatrists kept finding something that should have been obvious. This wasn't new. When they went back through the WWII records, the Korean War records, the WWI records, they found the same cluster of symptoms described over and over under different names: shell shock, battle fatigue, soldier's heart, war neurosis. The names changed with every conflict. The condition never did. In 1980, the American Psychiatric Association finally gave it a single name: post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. It had taken the psychiatric community until 1980 to formally acknowledge something that had been destroying soldiers since at least the American Civil War. And even then, the naming of it was not the understanding of it, because what researchers were discovering went far deeper than a psychological label. The trauma had changed the brain, not metaphorically, physically. Studies on WWII and Vietnam veterans using early neuroimaging showed structural differences in the brains of men with severe combat trauma. The hippocampus, the region responsible for contextualizing memory, for telling your brain when a threat is over, was measurably smaller. The amygdala, the brain's alarm system, was measurably more reactive. What this meant was brutal in its simplicity. The brain of a severely traumatized combat veteran was not a normal brain that was having bad thoughts. It was a structurally altered brain that had been physically reshaped by sustained extreme stress. The hippocampus, that should have been filing the war away as a past event, something that happened and ended, had been damaged to the point where it couldn't do that job properly.
The war was not a memory. For these men, the war was still happening. Every car backfire was a gunshot. Every crowded room was a kill zone to be assessed and controlled. Every moment of peace was a trap, a pause before the next attack, something to be waited out rather than lived in. Their nervous systems had been recalibrated by months and years of combat to treat the entire world as a battlefield. And then they were handed a mortgage and told to mow the lawn. Robert came home to a country that had no framework for what had happened to him. His wife didn't know, his doctor didn't know, he didn't know. What he did know was that something had come back from Europe that felt nothing like the person who left, that the garage on an ordinary Tuesday morning in 1947 felt more manageable than another night lying in the dark, listening to a house that was too quiet. He was not weak. He was running a nervous system that had been structurally altered by industrial violence on a scale the human species had never experienced before. And he had been given no language for it, no treatment for it, and no acknowledgement that it even existed. 16 million Americans served in WWII. Estimates of how many returned with what we would now recognize as PTSD ranged between 500,000 and over 1 million. The suicide rates among veterans in the post-war years were never fully tracked. The alcoholism rates were never fully tracked. The domestic violence rates were never fully tracked, because nobody was looking, because the official story was that the war was over. But here is what the science eventually made undeniable. Trauma on that scale does not stay with the person who experienced it. Studies on the children of severely traumatized WWII veterans found measurable differences in their stress response systems, the altered cortisol patterns, the heightened anxiety responses, the same hypervigilance, appearing in people who had never seen combat, transmitted not through experience, but through the nervous system of a parent who came home from a war the world had declared finished. The war did not end in 1945. It ended differently in every household that had sent someone to fight it. Some of those endings took years. Some took decades. Some are still happening now in the bodies of people who never knew why they were built the way they were. Robert's daughter is in her late 70s. She never knew what her father saw. She only knew that he left before she could remember him, that there was a before and an after in her family's history, and the line between them was a garage door closing on a spring morning in 1947. The war had given her father every opportunity to die. He had survived all of them, And then he came home to a world that had no idea what surviving had cost him. That cost had no name. Now it does. It just came 35 years too late for Robert, and for the hundreds of thousands of men exactly like him who fought the same war, won it, came home, and lost the only battle nobody had thought to prepare them for.